I never thought a simple lunch break would change my life forever. But one glance across a restaurant, one unexpected betrayal, and suddenly, everything I believed about love, loyalty, and trust came crashing down. It all started on a day that I normally wouldn't have found myself in a place like that. I had just finished dropping off one of our most difficult clients at the airport. One of those guys who loves the sound of his own voice and spent the entire ride complaining about everything under the sun. By the time I pulled away from the terminal, the last thing I wanted was to rush back to the office and dive into an afternoon of reviewing contracts. It was a gloomy Tuesday, the kind of day that made even the smallest tasks feel like a slog. So, instead of heading straight back to work, I decided to take a detour. About a mile from the airport, I spotted a dull-looking bar and grill. One of those places you drive by 100 times but never feel the urge to stop at. But that day, it seemed as good a place as any to grab a quiet lunch and nurse a beer or two before facing the grind again. I slid into a booth, sipped my drink, and found myself pondering one of life's great mysteries. Why was it so hard to find a decent burger these days? That's when something caught my eye. A couple had just walked in, and there was something about them that held my attention. They settled into a booth across the room, sitting side by side instead of across from each other, always a giveaway that things weren't exactly platonic. The woman was a blonde with a curvy figure, wearing a short skirt that showed off her legs and a snug pink top that left little to the imagination. Her companion was trying his best to look tough. Jeans, black leather jacket, the usual, but he didn't quite have the build or the presence to pull it off. He was too wiry, too awkward, and his attempt at a confident swagger just came across as forced. Now, normally I wouldn't have cared about some random couple in a bar. But in this case, the woman was Shelley, my sister-in-law. And the guy sitting next to her, practically glued to her side, was definitely not my brother, Dave. Worse still, they weren't just chatting like old friends catching up. As soon as they ordered drinks, they started going at it, kissing like a couple of teenagers in the back row of a movie theater. I sat there, stunned, watching as the guy slid his hand up her thigh until it disappeared under her skirt. Shelley broke away from the kiss, tilting her head back against the booth with a sigh that made it painfully clear this wasn't their first time doing this. At that moment, I knew there was no question about whether I was going to do something, I just had to decide how I was going to handle it. And honestly, the biggest challenge was stopping myself from walking over there and beating the living daylights out of both of them right then and there. I'd never liked Shelley. Not when my brother first introduced her, not when he fell head over heels for her, and certainly not when he announced, just 4 months in, that they were getting married. Dave was only 23 at the time, and I was convinced he had no clue what he was getting himself into. But trying to talk him out of it would have been pointless. To him, Shelley was everything. To me, she was just a pretty high-energy girl who was more self-absorbed than she let on. She wasn't as smart or as interesting as Dave, at least not in my eyes. But she was bubbly, charming, and always knew how to make people feel good about her. My brother adored that about her. It didn't take long to see that their favorite person, their shared priority, was Shelley herself. Dave would have moved mountains for her, and she was happy to let him. For the first 3 years of their marriage, I had to admit things seemed to be going well. Even I started to believe that maybe I had been wrong about her. But sitting there, watching her let some scrawny loser put his hands all over her in broad daylight, I knew those happy days were long gone. The guy had one arm wrapped around her waist, kissing her neck while his free hand wandered. She had her eyes closed, lost in the moment, so lost in fact, that she didn't even notice when I got up and started making my way toward them. But she sure as hell noticed when I reached their table. The look on her face when she saw me? Priceless. As I slid into the seat across from them, I leaned forward with a smile and said, "Well, hello there, Shelley." What a surprise. The reaction was almost comical. Her eyes snapped open wide, and her not-so-secret companion yanked his hands off her like he'd just touched a hot stove. He spun around to face me, his expression shifting from confusion to irritation in seconds. Shelley's face, though? That was a masterpiece. First she looked startled. Then the realization hit and her expression morphed into pure shock. Her jaw dropped and for a moment she just sat there frozen. Her boyfriend, for lack of a better word, wore the same dumbfounded look for a second before his brows furrowed in annoyance. Before he could get a word out, I kept my tone light and casual. "So, how've you been, Shelley? How's Dave?" Then, as if we were all just friendly acquaintances meeting by chance, I turned to the guy and extended my hand. "I'm Will, Shelley's brother-in-law." Her husband's brother. His eyes went wide. He didn't shake my hand. Didn't move at all, really. Just sat there, stiff as a board, clearly unsure of what to do next. Shelley, meanwhile, scrambled to collect herself. Her voice came out rushed and uneven. "Will? What a surprise. This is, Robbie. He's just an old friend. A really good. An old friend, huh? I cut in, still smiling. Looked like you two were getting really reacquainted just now, Robbie. Her face went pale as she realized exactly how much I had seen. Robbie, for his part, suddenly shot up from the booth like his seat had caught fire. I gotta go, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, without so much as a glance back at Shelley, he turned on his heel and bolted, out of the restaurant. I watched him go, then turned back to Shelley with a smirk. He seems like a real stand-up guy. Any idea why he left in such a hurry? Inside, though, I was seething. My brother worshipped this woman. He had built his entire world around her, given her everything she could possibly ask for. And this was how she repaid him? Running around behind his back with some greasy-haired loser who looked like he tried to grow a mustache and gave up halfway through? Shelley looked like she was about to faint. Her face had gone completely white. Well, I think you might have gotten the wrong idea, she stammered. We were just. Her words trailed off, and she stared at me helplessly, clearly struggling to come up with any excuse that would make this situation sound even remotely innocent. I let the silence hang between us for a few seconds before finally speaking, my voice low but laced with fury. You cheating piece of garbage. Shelley flinched, her mouth opening like she wanted to protest, but I kept going. Dave loves you. He adores you. He bends over backward to make you happy. But I guess that's not enough for you, huh? No, you have to go sneaking around behind his back with some sleazy nobody. How long has this been going on, Shelley? How many other guys are there? And more importantly, what do you think Dave's gonna say when he finds out? No, Will, please, she gasped, reaching across the table to grab my hand. Her grip was desperate, her fingers clinging like I was her last lifeline. Please, you can't tell him. Please, I'll do anything. I just looked at her. Was she serious? Did she actually think I'd lie to my own brother to cover for her? Shelley either had the intelligence of a brick or was too panicked to think straight. Dave wasn't just my brother, he was my best friend. He always had been. There was no universe in which I would protect her at his expense, and even she should have known that. I pulled my hand away from hers, shaking my head. Why shouldn't I tell him? Then with a bitter laugh I added, That's rich, Shelley. That's real good. I had expected Shelley to try and spin some excuse, maybe stumble through some half-baked defense, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer absurdity of what she said next. Well, I swear I'm not lying. She's been seeing some guy from her gym for at least a couple of weeks now. For a split second, her confidence threw me off balance. She was so sure, so unwavering that it rattled me more than I cared to admit. But I shook my head. Impossible. Andy and I had been together since sophomore year at Kenyon College. We had moved in together right after graduation, built a life side by side. There was no way she would do something like that. Sure, lately I'd noticed little things. Moments when she seemed distant, distracted at dinner, avoiding eye contact in ways that didn't quite feel like her. But cheating? No. I glanced back at Shelley, who was watching me closely, waiting for my next move. There was no world in which I would keep her affair a secret from Dave. But she didn't need to know that just yet. And as for Andy? I had to find out the truth one way or another. I exhaled slowly, then spoke. All right, Shelley. Maybe we can work something out here. I paused, choosing my words carefully, then continued. I'm not about to let Dave be made a fool of. But let me ask you something, Robbie. Is he the only one, or are there more? Her face turned red. He's the only one, she insisted, a little too quickly. I didn't believe her for a second. 20 minutes later, I was back in my car, driving toward the office with a sinking feeling in my gut. I was thinking about the end of Dave's marriage, something I now saw as inevitable, but also, maybe, the end of my own. You'd think the first thing I'd do was pick up the phone and call Dave, tell him exactly what his wife had been up to. But I just couldn't. I had always been the steady older brother, the one who kept things together. And as much as I hated to admit it, I needed to hear the truth from Andy herself. A part of me, God help me, was still clinging to the hope that Shelley was just grasping at straws trying to throw me off course. That she was wrong. That Andy was still the woman I believed she was. But that hope was fading fast. If Shelley had lied just to take the heat off herself, it would only make me angrier when I found out the truth. And if she wasn't lying? Well, I needed to be prepared. By the time I reached my office, my mind was already racing ahead. I sat down, pulled out a notepad, and started making a list of what would need to be done if the worst turned out to be real. Bank accounts, credit cards, selling the house, car titles. My hand moved on autopilot as I mapped out the potential fallout of a life unraveling. I could still hear Andy's voice in my head from just a few weeks ago. "I don't know what's going on with me lately," she had said, laughing softly. "A few weeks ago those black slacks you love were feeling too tight, and now they fit just right again." She had beamed at me then, her eyes full of warmth, and I had been struck, again, by how much I loved her. How much I still wanted to believe in her. God help her if she was lying. And God help me if she wasn't. I didn't know it at the time, but my marriage, official court dates aside, ended exactly 1 week later. On another Tuesday. Shelley and I had set everything in motion. I got a small tape recorder for her to hide in her purse, hoping to capture proof of what we both feared. That night, when the truth finally came out, it was one of the most painful nights of my life. I knew I couldn't listen to the tape until Andy was fast asleep. Until then, I had to keep up appearances, pretend everything was normal, play the role of the devoted husband, even as my stomach twisted with anticipation. That night she came home a little tipsy. She told me she'd spent the afternoon with Shelley, drinking way too much wine. She was in a good mood. More than that, she was affectionate. No, scratch that, she was downright eager. As soon as we finished clearing the dinner table, she was all over me, tugging at my hand and leading me toward the bedroom. "Honey," she purred, her voice dripping with playfulness, "do you have a little something for me tonight?" I forced a smile, playing along. As much as I hated myself for it, I needed her in this mood, unguarded, talkative. I wasn't looking for pleasure. I was looking for answers. And thanks to Shelley, I got them. She did her part perfectly, coaxing Andy into opening up over more wine. At first, the conversation was just flirty gossip. Shelley pretending to be scandalized while Andy laughed and confessed that Robbie was just the latest in a long line. "Not even the best," she admitted with a giggle. "There was a guy before him, Alice, but he moved away." I listened, stone-faced, while she shared every sleazy detail, every sordid confession. None of it surprised me. I had already seen who Shelley really was, but hearing it out loud would make it easier to convince Dave that his wife had been unfaithful. Then Andy's voice turned softer, almost guilty. "I never meant to cheat on Will. I still can't believe I'm doing it, and honestly I feel awful about it. He and I are happy together, I know that. And if he ever found out, he'd lose his mind. But," she sighed, "I don't know. I guess I've just got a bad case of BTF." There was a pause, then Shelley's voice, curious. "BTF? What's that?" Andy just laughed, a little tipsy now. "I'll explain, just pour me another glass." Then she went on. "You know I've been going to the health club for a couple of years now, right? I mean, working out bores me, but I didn't want to get out of shape. I didn't want Will to start looking at me differently." I could picture her leaning in closer, whispering with a grin. "Well, there's this guy Martin. And oh my God, Shelley, he's incredible in bed. He has this huge..." She cut herself off, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Big tool fever." Shelley laughed. "Big tool fever?" Andy looked around, making sure no one else could hear, then nodded. "Yeah. And trust me, Martin's got the biggest tool I've ever seen. Thick. Hard as a rock. The first time he flirted with me I thought it was harmless, but then, I don't know. He just knew exactly how to get me going. One day he got me so worked up I ended up in his office. And after that..." She giggled. "Whenever I could slip away, I did. I sat there, gripping the recorder, listening as my wife described, in detail, how she had been sneaking off to be with another man. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. Just a deep, hollow emptiness that swallowed me whole. I wasn't thinking. Not clearly anyway. I felt dazed, like I was watching everything unfold from a distance. Andy's voice played in my ears, but my mind struggled to process it. He locked the door behind us, sat me down in a chair, and without a word, dropped his shorts. She let out a small laugh, but there was no shame in it, just nostalgia. I swear I wasn't thinking at all. And then, we just went at it. It was wild. By the time he was done, I was completely exhausted. Shelley made a noise of surprise, and Andy just kept talking, as if confessing her infidelity was no bigger than swapping stories about a shopping trip. After that, he kept his distance for a while. I'd see him at the gym and he'd wink or flirt a little, but he didn't push. And I told myself, okay, it was a one-time thing. It's over. I even started to relax again, thinking I was past it. She paused. But then, about a week later, he caught me alone at the weight bench. The room was empty. And before I even knew what was happening, his hand was on mine, guiding it to him. She sighed almost dreamily. And just like that, we were back in his office. Silence stretched for a beat before Shelley let out a breathless laugh. And it was even better, Andy admitted, her voice thick with satisfaction. I can't even explain it, Shelley. I love sex with Will. We've always been great together. He satisfies me completely. But... She trailed off, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. I didn't need to hear any more. Whatever guilt she should have felt, whatever hesitation she might have had about betraying the man who had loved her unconditionally for 7 years, had been completely overpowered by her obsession with Martin. By 2:30 a.m., I had mapped out my plan. I had spent the past few hours sitting in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, knowing I was never going to share a bed with her again. I couldn't even look at her, let alone speak to her. The next morning, I slipped into the bedroom while she slept, grabbed my clothes for the day and left without a word. Legalities and decisions. A few hours later, I was sitting across from Margaret, my attorney. She picked up her phone, told her assistant to hold her calls, and pressed play on the tape recorder. For the next few minutes, we listened in silence. When it ended, she exhaled and looked at me. Okay. What do you want? A divorce? For adultery. None of this irreconcilable differences nonsense. I'll be fair with our savings, but I want the house. And she goes back to her maiden name. She doesn't deserve to be Mrs. Will Harris anymore. Margaret studied me carefully, nodding as she absorbed my demands. Excuse me for a moment. She left the room briefly and I sat there, my hands clenched into fists, waiting. When she returned, she sat down and shook her head. Quite a pair of wives you and your brother have. My jaw tightened and she immediately held up a hand. I'm sorry, Will. That was out of line. She cleared her throat and shifted back into lawyer mode. Here's the situation. The tape might not be admissible in court because Andy didn't know she was being recorded. However, Shelley can be subpoenaed and forced to testify about what Andy told her. So legally, it shouldn't make much of a difference. Once her lawyer hears this, she won't have much ground to stand on. I nodded, absorbing her words. I shook her hand, thanked her, and walked out of her office without looking back. The rest of the day, I buried myself in work, drowning in the logistics of dismantling my life as I knew it. I arranged for a locksmith to meet me at the house at 4:30. By then I planned to be gone. I made dinner plans with Dave, ensuring I wouldn't be there when Andy came home. In the meantime, I cut off her credit cards, set up separate bank accounts, and made sure her access to our shared money was completely severed. Then I sat down to write her a note. It took several tries. How do you say goodbye to the person you once thought was the love of your life, even after they've completely shattered your trust? No matter how justified I was, it wasn't easy. But eventually I found the words. I sealed the letter in an envelope, wrote Andy's name on the front, and left it where she'd find it. After that, I took a deep breath, grabbed my keys and walked out the door for the last time. Telling Dave. That evening, Dave and I met for dinner. We made small talk at first, but the weight of what I had to say sat like a stone in my chest. Finally, I exhaled sharply and just said it. Andy's been cheating on me. I'm divorcing her. Dave's fork froze halfway to his mouth. He blinked at me, mouth slightly open, utterly stunned. I wasn't sure I had ever seen my brother look that shocked before. Oh my God, Will. My God. Are you sure? He caught himself almost immediately, shaking his head. Sorry? Stupid question. I can see it all over your face. Do you want to talk about it? I did. So, as we ate, I told him everything. The beers helped, but honestly, just being able to unload the weight of it onto someone who had my back, no questions asked, meant more. There was no hesitation, no divided loyalties. He was completely on my side. And after the day I'd had, that mattered. Toward the end of dinner, I hesitated before saying, there's one part of this you need to hear for yourself. Dave frowned. Of course, Will. What do you need? I reached into my jacket, pulled out the tape recorder and slid it across the table. Just sit here and listen. I'll be in the other room. His brows furrowed. Wait, what? But I had already rewound the tape, pressed play and stepped away. I couldn't sit there while he listened. I didn't want to see his face change when the realization hit. At first, the only sound was the quiet murmur of voices from the recording. Then, crash. I winced. Looked like Dave had thrown something, probably an ashtray. I heard him pacing, then silence. When I finally walked back in, his hands were clenched into fists, his face pale with fury. How long have you known? His voice was tight, controlled, but barely. I sighed. I found out about Shelley a week ago. But I couldn't tell you, Dave. You wouldn't have believed me. You had to hear it. I sat back down, grabbed another beer and told him the whole story. By the end of the night, there were several empty bottles between us, and a new, bitter reality settling in. Neither of our marriages had been what we thought they were. I started from the beginning, telling Dave everything: how I first saw Shelley and Robbie at the restaurant, the deal she had offered me, the plan to make the tape, and my conversation with Margaret Adamson. "She's handling my divorce," I told him. "And if you want, she'll take yours too. Our cases are basically identical." Dave nodded but didn't say much. He was still processing everything. His first reaction wasn't anger, not at first. Instead, he went straight into problem-solving mode, pointing out that the tape might not be admissible in court. Margaret hadn't even bothered responding to that argument when Andy's lawyer brought it up. She simply let the silence do the talking. The fact was, admissible or not, the tape had done its job. As the court date got closer, Andy's attorney finally caved and reached out to Margaret, asking for a settlement conference. Meanwhile, Dave had made his decision. The day after hearing the tape, he packed up and moved out of his apartment with Shelley, settling into my guest room instead. He didn't just leave though. He wanted to do it on his terms. So he waited. He drove over to his old place, parked outside, and watched until Shelley left. Then he called me and we got to work. In less than 2 hours, we packed up everything he wanted and got him out of there. 10 weeks. That's all it took for our entire lives to be turned upside down. But through it all, Dave was solid. And I guess I was for him too. For those first couple of months, we lived like two single guys again. Grabbing dinner out more often than cooking, catching a ball game when we could, sitting around and talking over a few beers. We talked about everything, about Andy, about Shelley, about the life we thought we had with them. And, eventually, about what came next. "There are great women out there," Dave said more than once. "We just picked the wrong ones." I wanted to believe that. I really did. And maybe deep down I did. But in those first few weeks, it was hard to imagine trusting someone again. The final conversation. Eventually, I agreed to meet with Andy. Margaret wasn't thrilled about it, but I told her my terms. I'd listen, but I wasn't going to drop the adultery claim unless she gave me a real reason to. And if she did somehow convince me, we'd refile under irreconcilable differences instead. Part of me knew it was pointless. But another part, maybe the part that had loved her for 10 years, just couldn't walk away without one final conversation. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting across from me at the table. She looked different. Not guilty, not angry, just tired. For the longest time, neither of us spoke. Then she finally broke the silence. "Baby, it didn't mean anything." Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. And as much as I had prepared myself for anything she might say, that was the dumbest, most painful thing she could have chosen. "I know this is the worst thing I could have ever done to you," Andy whispered, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "But it didn't mean anything. It had nothing to do with how much I love you." I let her talk. I sat there, listening to the pleading tone in her voice, the same voice I had loved for years, but I wasn't really hearing her. Because there wasn't a single thing coming out of her mouth that I hadn't already predicted. She wasn't saying anything that could change my mind. Nothing I hadn't expected. Finally, I leaned forward, my voice steady. "Let's turn this around for a second." Andy blinked, surprised. "Imagine if I had been the one who cheated," I continued. "Not just some drunken mistake, not a one-time thing, but an affair. A full-blown, weeks-long thing with some woman I had been sneaking around with. Someone I didn't respect, didn't even like that much. Just someone who gave me a kind of physical pleasure that I never got from you. And then you found out." I let that sink in before going on. "Could you stay with me after that?" She swallowed hard, but I didn't let her speak. "Could you push past the hurt? The betrayal? Could you ignore the doubts creeping into your head, the ones that whisper that maybe you weren't enough for me? That maybe you'd never be the woman I really wanted?" Her face crumpled. Her lips parted, but she couldn't seem to find the words. "Yeah," I said, standing up. "That's what I thought." I turned and walked out. Margaret was waiting for me down the hall, her arms crossed, a surprisingly sympathetic expression on her usually unreadable face. "Give her irreconcilable differences," I muttered. "Doesn't make a damn bit of difference to me." She nodded and didn't press for details. Moving forward. That night, Dave and I sat at my kitchen table drinking. Not enough to be drunk, just enough to take the edge off. "Listen," I said, swirling the last of my beer in my glass. "I've made some plans." Dave nodded, waiting. "After all the legal fees, I still have nearly $800,000 left from the settlement. I've invested most of it, put it somewhere safe. But I kept $50,000 aside. For me. For a fresh start." Dave took a sip of his drink, thinking that over. Good. He had changed in the past few months. We both had. He'd gotten his old groove back, mostly thanks to the attention Shelley's betrayal had forced him to seek elsewhere. And we weren't exactly short on female company. His favorite move, one that somehow worked more often than not, was spotting two women sitting together at a bar, dragging me over to their table, flashing his most charming smile and saying, "Excuse me, ladies. I know it'd be weird to let a stranger buy you a drink, so let me introduce my brother, Will Harris." That was my cue as the supposed shy one to smile and say, "Nice to meet you both. This is my brother Dave." And just like that we were in. One night, though, was different. Her name was Shannon. She was a tall Irish redhead about a year younger than me. We did the usual, had drinks, laughed a lot, went out for dinner, did some dancing. And eventually we ended up back at my place. She was sexy and into it, just as eager to be with me as I was to be with her. But the thing that made it different was later, around 3 a.m. And I still couldn't figure out why. I woke up and just lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling. Shannon was still asleep beside me, her breath soft and steady. But my mind was somewhere else. I wasn't thinking about her. I was thinking about Andy. About everything we had built together. Everything we had lost. I must have been quieter than usual because Dave noticed. "Come on, bro, time to meet some new ladies." He clapped me on the back, giving me a knowing look. "That one was special," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Dave nodded. "I believe you. I liked her too. But she's gone home now, Will. And we've got 10 more days down here. I'm not ready to stop having fun yet." And that was Dave, always moving forward, never looking back. So, he dragged me off to the tennis courts, then the pool, and by evening, we were deep in conversation with two secretaries from San Francisco on their first ever trip outside the U.S. That night, though, they went back to their own hotel room and I was glad for the space. Unexpected encounters. A few days later, Dave and I were sitting over dinner when he glanced at me with a smirk. "I've got a little surprise for you." I sighed, already wary. "Does it involve tequila?" "No, not this time." "Then I don't want to know." I took a sip of my drink. "Let's just enjoy dinner, all right? Don't tell me what she's doing, what she looks like, nothing. I don't need it in my head." Dave held up his hands. "Fair enough." Then he launched into a funny story about a coworker who had been shamelessly flirting with him for weeks. He wasn't interested, but he was enjoying the game. I laughed at all the right parts, but my mind was still restless. We lingered over coffee, watching couples dance, when I suddenly felt a hand on my shoulder. And then I heard her voice. "Hello, Will." I turned and there she was. Andy. She looked beautiful. Different but not. And the way she was looking at me, it sent a rush of something through me that I didn't know how to handle. "You have no idea what being in your arms again does to me," she murmured. I didn't know what to say. So I didn't say anything. The song ended, but she wasn't ready to let go. "Have you ever wondered if you made the right decision, Will?" I took a slow breath, but before I could respond, she kept going. "I'll be completely honest with you, okay? I still think about us. About you. All the time." Then she smiled just a little. "But I usually don't get past wondering why you made the wrong decision." When I dropped Dave off later that night, he gave me a long look. "You sure you're okay, Will?" I sighed. "Yeah." It was a shock, but it was bound to happen eventually. I wasn't sure if I even believed that.